In the summer of 1942, the city of Stalingrad became the center of one of the most brutal battles in human history. For nearly 6 months, soldiers fought through shattered buildings, frozen streets, and burning factories in a struggle that would leave more than 2 million people dead, wounded, or missing. Entire armies were destroyed, civilians were trapped in a living nightmare, and by the time the battle ended in February 1943, the city itself had almost ceased to exist. But here's the question that still fascinates historians today. Why was the Battle of Stalingrad so deadly? To understand the scale of the disaster, you first have to understand why the city mattered so much. Stalingrad sat on the western bank of the Volga River, one of the most important waterways in the Soviet Union. Through that river flowed oil from the Caucasus, grain from the southern plains, and supplies that helped keep the Soviet war machine alive. If Germany captured the city, they would cut a major Soviet supply line. But there was also something else that made the city important: its name. The city carried the name of Joseph Stalin himself. For Adolf Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would be both a strategic and symbolic victory. For Stalin, losing it would be a humiliation that could shake the entire Soviet war effort. Neither dictator was willing to accept defeat. That decision condemned hundreds of thousands of soldiers to one of the most brutal battles ever fought. The German offensive began in the summer of 1942 as part of a massive campaign to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. German forces advanced rapidly across Soviet territory, pushing toward the Volga River by August. German aircraft began bombing Stalingrad relentlessly, turning entire districts of the city into ruins. But something unexpected happened. Instead of destroying the Soviet defenses, the bombing actually made the city harder to capture. The shattered buildings created a maze of rubble, broken walls, and underground hiding places that were perfect for defenders. What followed was not a traditional battle of large maneuvers and open fields. It became a slow and brutal war of inches. German and Soviet soldiers fought for staircases, basements, and hallways. Sometimes battles were fought for individual rooms inside shattered apartment blocks or factories. A single building could change hands several times in one day. German soldiers even had a grim nickname for this type of combat. They called it Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, because the fighting took place in ruins, tunnels, and rubble like animals battling in the dark. Tanks, which normally dominated open battlefields, became far less effective inside the city. Narrow streets and destroyed buildings made maneuvering almost impossible. Infantry soldiers were forced into brutal close-quarters combat. Grenades, knives, and submachine guns became the most important weapons. Casualties mounted quickly, but the fighting itself was only one part of the disaster. Another major reason Stalingrad became so deadly was the determination of both sides to never retreat. In July 1942, Joseph Stalin issued one of the most famous orders of the war. Order No. 227. Its message was simple: not one step back. Soviet troops were told that retreat without orders would be punished severely. For many soldiers, there was no option except to fight. But the German army faced a similar problem. Adolf Hitler also refused to allow retreat. Even when German commanders warned that their troops were becoming trapped inside the city, Hitler insisted they hold their ground. 2 massive armies were now locked in a battle where neither side was allowed to withdraw. The result was catastrophic. Then came the winter. By late 1942, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snow covered the ruins of the city. Weapons froze. Vehicles stopped working. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Many men died not from bullets, but from frostbite and exposure. Food became scarce, and German soldiers trapped in the ruins sometimes survived on frozen horse meat or scraps of rations dropped from aircraft. But even those supplies were not nearly enough. In November 1942, the Soviet army launched a massive counterattack. Instead of attacking the strongest German forces inside the city, Soviet commanders targeted the weaker armies guarding the flanks of the German advance. Romanian and Hungarian units defending those positions were quickly overwhelmed. Within days, Soviet forces had encircled the German 6th Army inside Stalingrad. More than 250,000 German soldiers were now trapped. It was one of the largest encirclements in military history. German commanders immediately requested permission to break out, but Hitler refused. He promised that the trapped army would be supplied by air until relief forces could arrive. In reality, the plan was impossible. The German Air Force simply did not have enough aircraft to deliver the massive amounts of food, fuel, and ammunition the army needed. As the weeks passed, the trapped soldiers grew weaker. Starvation spread through the ranks. Ammunition ran low. Hospitals filled with wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated. Meanwhile, Soviet forces tightened the ring around the city. Artillery bombarded German positions daily. Winter storms made flying nearly impossible. The situation became hopeless. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army had been split into smaller pockets of resistance. On February 2, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad finally surrendered. What remained of the once powerful army was barely recognizable. Of the roughly 300,000 Axis soldiers who had entered the battle, only about 90,000 survived to become prisoners of war. Most of them would never return home. But the Soviet Union paid an enormous price as well. Soviet casualties were staggering, with more than 1 million soldiers killed, wounded, or missing during the battle. The city itself had been almost completely destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Factories were shattered. Streets were buried under debris. Civilians who survived months of bombing and starvation emerged into a city that barely existed. Yet despite the horrific cost, Stalingrad became one of the most important turning points of the Second World War. For the first time, an entire German army had been destroyed. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. From that point forward, Soviet forces began pushing westward, slowly driving German armies back across Eastern Europe. So why was Stalingrad so deadly? It was the result of several forces colliding at once. A strategically important city that neither side could afford to lose. Urban warfare that forced soldiers into brutal close-quarters combat. Bombing that turned the city into a deadly maze of rubble. Orders from both Hitler and Stalin prevented retreat. Freezing winter conditions killed almost as many men as combat. And finally, the massive encirclement trapped an entire army with no hope of escape. All of these factors combined to create one of the deadliest battles ever fought. Today, Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, stands as a reminder of the immense human cost of total war. Behind every statistic were real people. Soldiers fighting for survival in ruined buildings. Civilians hiding in basements as bombs fell overhead. And entire armies locked in a struggle where surrender came only after unimaginable suffering. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military turning point. It was a warning about how destructive modern warfare can become when pride, ideology, and power collide. And that is why, more than 80 years later, Stalingrad remains one of the deadliest battles in human history.